Hello friends, we are so glad that you're able to join us in this Bible study, in this program, Books of the Book. My name is David Rodriguez and we are studying the Gospel of John. And with me is Dr. John Pauline. He is the Dean of Religion at Loma Linda University. Welcome, Dr. Pauline.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
All right, good to have you. You know, the last program we were talking about how Jesus was directing the disciples and he said to them, I am the vine, you are the branches. And earlier in another program you said that he referred to the branches as the disciples. Mm-hmm. Now, tell us a little more about that.
Well, I think obviously some people might have questions about it, so I'm glad you brought that back. Because I think even if you look at some commentaries, people will say, I am the vine, you are the branches. That's talking to us, you know, about our relationship with Jesus. And that's what I would call a devotional reading. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's powerful, it's helpful. But it's kind of related to what we talked in the first program about a Hollywood kind of Jesus, where all you see about Jesus is what makes sense to us, you see. But if you don't take that story out of its context, actually go back into the context, when Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches, he's talking to his disciples. They're having a conversation back and forth. So the scholarly approach to the book is not to undo the devotional approach, because that has its own value. But when you see the original context of the story, when you read it the way it was written, and you realize Jesus is saying something to these disciples, then you're seeing something bigger, something different, something additional. John has a story to tell too. And we miss it sometimes when we read it only in the light of the other Gospels, when we read it only devotionally. And we miss some very powerful things. So I was pointing out that in that story of the vine and branches was a message to the second generation, who never had a physical contact with Jesus, that if they stayed connected to the disciples, they would be the fruit. You see, if they stay connected to the disciples, then they would be connected to Jesus through the disciples. So the words of the gospel, the words of John, are our connection to Jesus through the disciple John.
So it can be viewed both ways, that the disciples today, we are also the branches, right?
Yeah. You see, scholars in the last 50 years have more and more started reading these Bible books, attempting to understand the original context and what actually was happening there. And in doing that, we spot all kinds of things that we had missed before, and things that could give us fresh insights into God, fresh insights into Jesus. I don't want us to miss those treasures by simply saying over and over what people have seen through the centuries. So if some of our viewers are saying, I never heard that before, that's true. There was a time in my life I hadn't heard it before either. But as you read the gospel in the original language, understanding the context in which it was written, some things emerge that you would have missed before. And John has a lot of depths in this gospel that people have missed.
Well, you know, what are we studying today in the Gospel of John?
Well, this is the third of 3 programs where we're looking at the entire gospel and just sort of asking what's special about it, what's unique about it, what's different. If you were to take the 4 gospels and put them side by side and mark everything that's similar, the unmarked stuff is what's unique to that gospel. And in trying to understand any of these gospels, it's good to start with that unique stuff. And that's what we've been doing here. Now, who wrote John is a question that comes up. It says John, right? But that's a title that's on there. If you actually read the text, it doesn't say who the author is. It's kind of anonymous. But it does suggest at the very end that the author of the gospel was a beloved disciple. So it's somebody who was one of the 12. He was with Jesus, and he's often a companion of Peter in the gospel. So there's a beloved disciple, not named, who's always wherever Peter is. When you get to the book of Acts, which John didn't write, you get there, Peter is always traveling around with John. You see? So John isn't mentioned here, but he's a disciple that Jesus loved who's always with Peter. And so from that we get the sense that John is the one that wrote this gospel, and that's what the early church decided, and they put that on as the title.
Around what time was the Gospel of John written? Do we have any information about that?
Well, you know, it's very, very interesting that scholars at one time, particularly skeptical scholars, thought it was written as late as 170 AD, which would be several generations after the time of Jesus. And in doing that, they basically said the gospel is not historical. It doesn't tell us a real story of Jesus. It's simply made up stories. Mm-hmm. Well, there's a problem with that theory. They've recently found a fragment of a manuscript about this size that has John 18 in it. And the date of that manuscript is about 115 AD. In other words, 60 years earlier than what people thought. If you've got copies of the Gospel of John in 115, it must have been written even earlier. So scholars today are pretty united that the Gospel of John is probably the last book written in the New Testament, even after the book of Revelation.
Not the last gospel, but the last book of the New Testament.
Right, yeah. The other Gospels were quite a bit earlier. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they were written sort of in the lifetime of most of the disciples. But John outlives the disciples, and just before he dies, if you remember the context from our last program, just before he dies, he writes this gospel to forestall the rumor that he was going to live till Jesus comes. Mm-hmm. You see? So, Gospel of John is probably the last gospel written, maybe 95, 100 AD, which is 70 years after the crucifixion. John was an old man there. And so the Gospel of John comes to us within the lifetime of one of the disciples, so it still has that memory of the actual Jesus.
So John writes the Gospel just before he dies. Mm-hmm. Where does he write the Gospel?
Well, that's an interesting story because some of the early church fathers talk about that. And they suggest that John and his community were in Jerusalem for decades after Jesus died on the cross. But then just before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, you may remember the Romans came around the mid-60s, mm-hmm. 35 years or so after the crucifixion. They surrounded Jerusalem, and then one night they just left. And people remembered that Jesus had said, when you see the city surrounded by armies, know that its destruction is near. So when the Romans left, a lot of the Christians escaped, remembering the words mm-hmm. of Jesus. And John and his community went across the Jordan River into what we would call Jordan today. And they stayed there for a while, and then the community left and went to Asia Minor. So we have evidence that John lived in Ephesus at the latter end of his life. We know that he was on Patmos for a time, an island off the coast there that can be visited today. And Ephesus can be visited today. It's a remarkable ancient ruin. So it was probably written from Ephesus.
Now, John did not only write the Gospel, right? He wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John.
Right.
He wrote Revelation.
Yeah.
Can you give us maybe the Gospel? Where along that period did he write it? Or
we don't know exactly. I mean, it's possible. It's generally felt that the Gospel was written after he left Patmos. We know that in 96 AD, the emperor that imprisoned John on Patmos died and was replaced by a new dynasty. And so it's usually assumed that in 96 he was released to go back to Ephesus. And it is felt that those 3 letters in the gospel was written at that time. I personally think the Gospel was the very last one written because its very context is the impending death of John. But this John, while he writes from Ephesus, he knows Palestine very well. Mm-hmm. And here's an interesting piece of it. Luke doesn't know Palestine. When you read the Gospel of Luke, he doesn't know the relationship of all these things. He's not a local. He's getting this secondhand. He's interviewing people. He's reading Gospels, and he's putting this together. So in Luke, Jesus sets out from Galilee to Jerusalem. His first stop on the trip is Bethany, 2 miles out of Jerusalem. Then he travels for 8 more chapters and ends up in Jericho, 27 miles from Jerusalem. You see, clearly some things are mixed up in terms of the geography. That was not Luke's strength, was the geography, because he had never lived there except maybe for a short time with Paul on one of the visits there. So John, on the other hand, he knows it back and forth. He knows where Jacob's well is. Mm-hmm. You can visit Jacob's well today. Many scholars doubted the Bible because they said, there's a story of the Pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. There is no Pool of Bethesda. Well, guess what? We found it. And it's 100 meters by 70 meters. It's huge, but it just was forgotten. And they thought, oh, John doesn't know what he's talking about. He's talking about Pool of Bethesda. Well, it's actually there. And
so John writes those details.
Yes.
Which is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are little historical details in the Gospel of John no other writer has, and they're proven to be accurate. For example, he says that Jesus in John 10 was in Solomon's portico, and it was winter. Mm-hmm. Well, what does that have to do with anything? Solomon's portico is the part of the temple that got sun at the end of the day and was sheltered from the wind, which in wintertime came the other direction. If it's winter, that's the one part of the temple court you want to be, because it's nice, 20 degrees Celsius in there, even though it's freezing everywhere else. You can have classes there. There's no wind, there's no chill. The sun is beating in and warming that little portico there. So there's a little detail that could only be here if the guy knew what he was talking about. He was sharing actual events with details that prove that they actually occurred. And so when he says, for example, that Peter gestures to John at the table, he's kind of like, tells John, hey, ask him a question. When he does that, we take him seriously because those details are all through the gospel. John has a number of these little details no other gospel writer has, and they connect with archaeology and with history. So we find it to be a very believable gospel.
Tell us about John, the person. Who was John? What was different about him than perhaps the other 11 disciples?
Well, John was probably the youngest of the disciples. I mean, he lived a long, long time afterward, so he may have been just a teenager when he was following Jesus. And one of the things that's mentioned about him is that he was a son of thunder.
Okay.
Now, that suggests somebody who's kind of loud and noisy, the big mouth and stuff like that. Perhaps he mellowed out a little bit as he got older, because he seems more, gentler and humble at the time the gospel was written. But when he was following Jesus, he was a bit of a troublemaker. He and his brother came to Jesus, and the mother is asking for them, can they sit at your right hand and left when you get into the kingdom?
Even while being a disciple of Jesus, he was mischievous.
Yeah. And there was one time when they're passing through a Samaritan village and the people refused them hospitality. They says, hey, shall we call fire down from heaven to destroy the village? So
that was not always his character. Yeah. Eventually, after so long with Jesus, his character was eventually transformed. Mm-hmm. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And even in the gospel, or not the gospel, but his letters, his epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, or, they talk so much of God's love.
Yeah, that's right. So he definitely mellowed. As he walked with Jesus, Jesus, made a difference in his heart and changed him. Well, there's a lot of things about the Gospel of John that are definitely unique to John, and we'll get back to some of those after a break.